Who do you think is the most formidable atheist today, the most formidable champion of it
I think
today?
without a doubt it's Graham Oppy, your fellow, your compatriot.
Yeah.
He is scary smart. Scary smart.
This video is the first of a series that I intend to make for arguments for atheism, i.e., arguments against God. The first argument I present here will, in effect, be a summary of Graham Oppy's book, The Best Argument Against God. I caveat, though, that everything I say about this book isn't and shouldn't be taken as verbatim. I put Oppy's book in my own words, and I leave out parts that I take to be unsuited for my present purposes. With that being said, the reason I start with this argument from Oppy is because I think it serves as the best foundation to any further argument for or against God. This book acts as a clean, white canvas for natural theology. One is now clearly able to paint the relevant considerations into the canvas. As we will see, exactly how to think about arguments for and against God, just as a child is presented with a canvas and taught to neatly paint within its confines, as opposed to smearing paint everywhere, one will learn to think neatly, clearly, assessing and placing the relevant evidence into a clear body or image, as opposed to the typical muddled, splattered thoughts reflected in a child's careless tossing of paint. Additionally, we will learn not just how to think, but what to think. What are the relevant data here? How can we sort them? No longer shall we proceed along one dimension. One argument for God is one stroke of a brush in a much larger painting on a much larger canvas. This is the central method at play. An artist's work isn't constituted by a single stroke. Artists are differentiated from one another by the totality of brushings in the final image taken by each stroke. So too, will we best judge this deep fundamental question of God's existence, not along the merits of one single argument, datum, or reflection, as many are inclined. Rather, we will take the hypotheses at play, evaluate their merits, proceed then to add the relevant data, after which we will step back and see what final form awaits us. Initially, we start off by comparing what we stipulate as minimal theism to that of what we stipulate as minimal naturalism. Minimal theism is the hypothesis that there are gods, supernatural forces, or beings. Minimal naturalism is the hypothesis that causal reality is natural reality. The first thing we do is we analyze the hypotheses of minimal naturalism and theism absent any data, just on the merits of the bare hypotheses themselves. We then add a host of data and see how the data fits in to the minimal hypotheses. After the analysis of the data, we then expand minimal theism to include slightly more than its initial conception. After the expansion, we add further data not yet considered prior to the expansion of minimal theism, and of course, we then conclude after having evaluated all of the data and the expanded versions of the hypotheses, which hypothesis has the most theoretical virtue. What is theoretical virtue? Well, when comparing two hypotheses, theories, beliefs, what have you, we have 4 criteria, generally speaking, that we use to assess which theory is more likely true. The first of the 4 criteria used to assess theories is called simplicity. Now, we need to get 2 things straight about this criteria. The first is that the criteria of simplicity does not state that the simpler hypothesis is more likely true. Rather, if all else is equal between 2 hypotheses, besides for simplicity, then the simpler hypothesis is more likely true. But again, that's only if all else is equal. That's the important condition. So don't get that wrong. The second thing we need to understand about simplicity is how to actually detect it. When we look for simplicity, what are we looking for? I'm going to list what we're looking for and then explain what I mean, because I'm going to use some words you may not be familiar with. Simplicity looks like less primitive entities in one's hypothesis, simpler primitive entities rather than complex ones. The same is true of fewer and less complex primitive features and principles. Primitive here means basic or fundamental, not reducible to, analyzable, or explained in terms of anything more fundamental. So when we posit in a hypothesis something that is primitive, the primitive thing will not have a further explanation. And the less we have to do that, the less primitive things we posit in a hypothesis, the better. Your hypothesis is more simple if you can avoid positing a larger amount of primitive features, entities, or what have you. The second criteria used to assess theories is called goodness of fit. I take it that goodness of fit with data is self-explanatory. I'll move on then to the third criteria used when assessing theories: explanatory breadth. The way this criteria applies when assessing two theories is that if all is equal between two theories, the one that explains more is more likely to be true and should be preferred. Now, explaining more has two dimensions. The first is leaving less unexplained. The second is unifying a wider domain of features. We then go to the fourth criteria used when assessing theories, and that is predictive fruitfulness. If all else is equal between two hypotheses or theories, the one that makes the most accurate predictions of the future data and the theory that promotes the most fruitful avenue of future inquiry should be preferred. We started off by stating the two theories we will compare, namely that of minimal theism to that of minimal naturalism. We now gave the four criteria we can use to assess the likelihood, the preferability of theories. So let's take these four criteria and turn back to our minimal conceptions of naturalism and theism and see if one is in fact more preferable to the other prior to the data, prior to the elaboration of the theories. Minimal theism stated that there are gods, supernatural forces, or beings. Minimal naturalism stated causal reality is natural reality. Given just these minimal conceptions and our criteria for evaluating theories, naturalism has one advantage with one of the criterion stated, namely simplicity. Minimal naturalism posits fewer kinds of primitive entities, fewer kinds of primitive properties and principles. Theism has two kinds of entities, natural and supernatural, and two kinds of causation, natural causation and supernatural causation, while naturalism has one kind of entity, the natural, and one kind of causation, natural causation. So, just in the category of simplicity, theism, in fact, is inferior to naturalism. This means that if we introduce all of the data and elaborate both hypotheses, if doing so doesn't give us reason to favor theism over naturalism, then naturalism is going to win because it started off with a simplicity advantage. So if the data doesn't overcome that initial starting advantage, then the data doesn't need to favor naturalism for naturalism to win. All we need for naturalism to win is for the data to be equal. Because then, as we stated, if all is equal between two hypotheses, besides for simplicity, favor the hypothesis that is more simple, because it's more likely true. I'm going to re-emphasize this because how crucial a point I think it makes in the conversation between theism and atheism and/or agnosticism. You can often hear people say, I am agnostic because the data isn't clearly favorable to either hypothesis. Or, I'm agnostic because I don't see evidence for theism. But what follows from the simplicity advantage of naturalism is that if there's an absence of evidence in favor of naturalism over theism, or if the evidence is equal to that of naturalism and theism, that we should all prefer naturalism and we shouldn't be agnostic. That is the crucial implication of the initial simplicity advantage. It shouldn't be lost on the listeners. With all of that being said, before we get into the data, I'm going to list the relevant data so that the listener can be cognizant of the relevant considerations, the relevant data that are at play when arguing, when comparing the naturalistic and theistic worldview or hypothesis. It is so important that one not be hyperfixed or isolate or cherry-pick one of these particular datum points and ignore the rest and hastily conclude or declare the victory, the truth of one of the two hypotheses. All of the data about to be listed should be taken into account. All of the data about to be listed are crucial and relevant when comparing the global preferability of these two hypotheses. Here are the 9 pieces of data we consider prior to expanding minimal theism. Number 1, global causal reality. Number 2, the fine-tuning of the constants of the universe. Number 3, the history of the Earth. Number 4, the history of humanity. Number 5, a priori knowledge. Number 6, morality and human flourishing. Number 7, consciousness and reason. Number 8, religious experience. Number 9, scripture, authority, and organized tradition. Then, after we elaborate on theism and expand it from its minimal conception, we add yet 4 more pieces of data, namely that of human suffering. Number 2, salvation. Number 3, meaning and purpose. Number 4, hiddenness and non-belief. So in total then, we're going to be considering 13 pieces of data, 9 prior to elaboration from the standard minimal conception of theism, and 4 pieces of data after elaborating from minimal theism to a more expanded version of theism. So the first piece of data we consider is global causal reality. We can ask, why are there any causal stuff at all? In answering this question, will the answer provided by theism or naturalism be more favorable to that of the alternative answer? Well, what can the naturalist say here? The naturalist could say, it's simply impossible that there be no causal stuff, i.e., there had to be causal stuff. The existence of causal stuff is necessary. The naturalist can alternatively say, it's simply a brute fact that there are causal stuff, i.e., there's no reason for why there are causal stuff. So these are the 2 options for the naturalist. What can the theist say? The theist has the same dichotomy. Either there are causal stuff because it's necessary, or there are causal stuff and the fact that there are causal stuff is simply a brute fact. Why is this the only 2 options available to the theist? Well, consider this. If the theist thinks that in every possible world, God engages in causal activity, well, then it's impossible that there be no causal stuff, because possibility just means in a alternative possible world. But if in every alternative possible world you get the same outcome, then that outcome is necessary, as necessary just means exists in every possible world. So the first option for the theist, then, is that God engages in causal activity in every possible world, meaning that the existence of causal things is necessary. Alternatively, the theist can think it's possible that God didn't engage in any causal activity. But then it follows that if it's a possibility that God not engage in causal activity, but God in fact engaged in causal activity, then it's just a brute fact that he did so. So given that the theist and naturalist have the exact same options when it comes to explaining global causal reality, neither the theist or naturalist is thereby favored in the consideration of this data. We then move on to the second piece of data, the data of fine-tuning. We can ask, why do the cosmic parameters take the values that they do? Again, the naturalist can say it's either necessary or a brute fact, and the theist can say again, either it's necessary that God make these parameters, or it's a brute fact that God makes these parameters. The theist may object here that surely there's an advantage in saying that God chose life-permitting parameters so as to allow for human life. This explanation, so the theist may object, is preferable to the naturalistic one that the parameters take the values they do either out of necessity or merely because it's a brute fact. However, the theistic explanation is only better if the following holds. Namely, the naturalist allows for a much larger range of values the parameters could have taken than the range of values the parameters could have taken allowed for by the theist. In other words, so long as the theist and naturalist have an equal range of possible values the parameters could have taken, then their explanation for that value will also be the same. And this range is in fact equal. It is not the case that the naturalist allows for a much wider range of possible parameters. No, why would they? That's entirely arbitrary. The range of possible values the parameters could have taken is equal on both hypotheses, and therefore their explanation is equal. After all, for the naturalist, it's just a brute fact the parameters take a given value from a given range, as it is a brute fact for the theist that from the same range of potential values, a particular one was selected, this selection being a brute fact. Reverse what I just said and plug in the word necessary, you get the same conclusion. As if God had to have chosen life-permitting constants, then it's just necessary that there are life-permitting constants, and if God could have chosen non-life-permitting constants, but he didn't, it follows then that he didn't have to make life-permitting ones, and the fact that he did is just brute. So in conclusion, the same options open to the theist are as well open to the naturalist, and none can give a better, more preferable account of why the constants are life-permitting. So we move on then to our third piece of data, the history of the Earth. In particular, we ask two questions. Number one, does the accumulated body of natural science favor theism or naturalism? Second, does the existence of complex living organisms and complex ecological systems favor theism over naturalism or vice versa? One may argue that the accumulated body of natural sciences actually favors naturalism, the reason being that there isn't a single well-established result of science that depends on postulating God. If one looks in the texts of the leading scientific academia, one does not find the text opening up with, and we start with the supposition that God exists and is the creator of all. And only from this supposition are we then able to build upon and infer the following results from the sciences. However, this argument assumes that if God were to exist, his existence would have direct implications on the natural sciences. The theist need not and probably does not make this assumption, so given this, the accumulated knowledge of the natural sciences does not favor naturalism or theism. What about the existence of complex living organisms? Well, some theists will say that science gives an incomplete explanation for the existence of such things, while other theists are inclined to say the explanation that science gives is erroneous. However, to say that the explanation science gives for the existence of complex living organisms is erroneous is no doubt a win for the naturalist, as there's no alternative theory with equal simplicity, predictive accuracy, goodness of fit, explanatory breadth, etc. Often the theists making the erroneous claim will offer up biological, teleological, design arguments for God, the most famous of which being Paley's watch argument, which we shall examine right here. Paley's watch argument states that if you find a watch, you should infer design. For the same reasons, one should infer nature's design. According to Paley, the reason for the watch inference is that the watch, its parts, and its materials are suited toward a purpose. There are two problems here. The first is that Paley's stated basis for making the inference that the watch was designed may not actually be the basis he provides, and the legitimate basis by which we can make that inference is not found in nature. In other words, the real reason we can infer the watch is designed will not be found in nature, so we can't infer that nature's designed. Take, for instance, the Antikythera mechanism found in 1901. We immediately knew it was designed, however, we only discerned its function more than 50 years after having found it. How did we know the Antikythera mechanism was designed? First off, its materials are materials not found in nature, for example, its constitution of bronze. Second, its shape is not one found in nature. Third, it had cogwheels. Now, all of these things were the basis by which we inferred it was designed, And unlike Paley's basis, these three things are not found in nature. We don't go out into nature and find bronze, we don't go out into nature and find shapes that are not natural, and we don't go out into nature and find cogwheels going on trees. And so the basis by which we infer a watch is designed do not apply to nature, and thus we can infer that nature is designed. The second problem with Paley's watch argument is that function doesn't actually imply design. For example, a rabbit's heart surely has a function, but the atheist will not concede that it is designed. Rather, the atheist will concede its function was granted to it given evolution, not a design, namely God. Also, the problems present in Paley's argument generate to many contemporary biological design arguments, like the argument from irreducible complexity. The argument from irreducible complexity states that if X is irreducibly complex, infer that X is designed. Something is irreducibly complex just in case it has many parts interacting to serve a function, and the removal of any one of those parts destroys the function. However, the two problems that plagued Paley's watch argument apply here as well. The first being that we can and do recognize that something is designed without knowing that the designed thing is irreducibly complex. The second problem is that not only is irreducible complexity not a necessary condition in order to recognize design, but it's neither a sufficient one. For example, humans are irreducibly complex. If you move our brains, lungs, heart, etc., we will stop serving a function. However, this fact alone doesn't debunk evolution, i.e. non-design as an explanation. This concludes our third piece of data, namely the history of the Earth, as we have shown that it doesn't favor naturalism over theism or vice versa. We move on then to our fourth piece of data, the history of humanity. We ask two questions in particular. Do the social sciences favor either theism or naturalism? And second, do reports of miracles favor either theism or naturalism? Again, the accumulated body of the social sciences do not rely on postulating a god, but neither does the theist's expectation of a god's existence have implications to the social sciences, so considerations as to the accumulated body of the social sciences fall neither way. What about reports of miracles? Well, it's uncontroversial that no miracle has been confirmed by natural and social scientific investigation. It's also non-controversial that these miracle claims are full of connivery and folly. Thus, we need to be given a good reason to think that a particular report of a miracle is distinguishable from the vast body of the miraculous and anomalous reports. A David Hume quote captures this problem very well. Quote, "First, there has never been found in all of history any miracle attested by a sufficient number of men of such unquestionable good sense, education, and learning as to secure against all delusions in themselves, of such undoubted integrity as to place them beyond all suspicion of any design to deceive others, of such credit and reputation in the eyes of mankind as to have a great deal to lose in case of their being detected in any falsehood, and at the same time attesting facts performed in such a public manner and in so celebrated a part of the world as to render the detection unavoidable, all which circumstances are requisites to give us a full assurance in the testimony of men." End quote. Now, I would like to add, and this is not Graham Oppy speaking in the first person or David Hume, but rather me, the producer of this video, that all of the mutually incompatible supernatural and miraculous claims are best explained in terms of human dishonesty, self-delusion, and fallibility, as the many incompatible reports is best predicted under the fallibility hypothesis. We conclude this fourth piece of data, the history of humanity, as it has not favored either theism or naturalism. We move on then to our fifth piece of data, a priori knowledge. A priori knowledge of math, logic, statistics, and the like. Do these truths, or our knowledge of these truths, favor theism or naturalism? Some theists, like René Descartes, think that God establishes these truths. This is wrong. Prior to God establishing mathematical, logical, statistical, and metaphysical truths, God was identical to himself, there was one God, etc. These facts necessitating logic, mathematic, and metaphysical truths. Also, one can't escape this by saying that God both establishes these truths and these things are always true, as saying that he establishes them commits one to saying that the latter thing is causally prior to the former. In other words, these truths cannot be causally derivative necessities. And even if we grant that they can, they definitely cannot come from the choice of a libertarian free agent, because by definition, the choice of a libertarian free agent cannot bring about derivative causal necessities. That deals with the truths of our a priori knowledge, but what about our knowledge itself? Some say we have knowledge of these things solely because God made us able to know them. However, this seems false. Surely there are some truths of math, statistics, logic, and metaphysics that we can know through testimony or training and education by others, and also directly, like through Euclid's proof that there are infinitely many primes. One may argue that numbers make arithmetic claims true, but naturalists deny that we can causally interact with them. So how can naturalists know numbers? The answer is that we needn't causally interact with numbers and non-natural mathematical objects in order to know them. Also, there are nominalists, fictionalists, and structuralists who deny a domain of things, the numbers. Then there are Platonists. They think there is such a domain that make arithmetic claims true. However, we don't need to know of that domain by a causal interaction. Rather, we can infer that such a domain exists. So a naturalist can account for their a priori knowledge of mathematical truths. What about the following argument? What if a theist comes along and says, hey, you can't construct a logical proof that entails one should accept the basic logical principles, because said proof would presuppose the very principles you're trying to prove the acceptance of. Given this, we need to be, so to speak, programmed to accept basic logical principles. And God provides a great explanation as to why, by and large, humans are programmed to accept these basic logical principles. The naturalist can retort that evolution explains people's programmed acceptance of the logical principles, and we need not appeal to a god. Therefore, it seems this fifth piece of data, our a priori knowledge, doesn't favor either theism or naturalism, so we should move on then to our sixth piece of data, morality and human flourishing. Here, Oppy moves forward with what seems to be his favorite chess opening, so to speak. He says that either on the theistic or naturalist worldview, if you posit morality, morality is going to turn out to be necessary and or primitive, making the commitment to morality an equal theoretical commitment regardless of the view you take. What about the view that God establishes morality? Well, if such a view, we can ask, prior to God's establishment of morality, surely God was all good, loving, kind, etc. Secondarily, God did not have the option to make murder, rape, lying, stealing, and cheating right just by saying so. Both of these considerations, the first of which is about what God is fundamentally, the second of which is what God could have made good and bad, show that there's a standard of good and bad independent of what God commands. Then, of course, there's the option that morality doesn't exist, but this is going to favor the naturalist over the theist, obviously. What about moral knowledge? If there is no such thing, that's going to favor naturalism. If there is such a thing, morality is plausibly necessary and somewhat theoretically primitive, favoring neither theism or naturalism. What about the existence of a conscience? Both the theist and naturalist will say this is in terms of an agent looking beyond themselves towards some other standard. The theist will say that standard is God, the naturalist will say that standard is their friends, family, and society at large. Thus, the existence of a conscience doesn't favor either theism or naturalism, as both have a perfectly good explanation for its obtaining. What about virtue? Are religious people more virtuous, and does this give us reason to prefer theism over naturalism? The answer is no and no. Societal data from countries with more theists doesn't correlate with more virtue. In fact, there may be a reverse correlation. Additional data seems to suggest that naturalists are less likely to end up in US prisons. Further data suggests that naturalists on average are smarter and better educated wherever they are found. And there's a positive correlation between intelligence and education and decreased societal dysfunction. Regardless of this, we should be wary of a group claiming to be more virtuous simply because of their espoused naturalism or theism. And even if one group was more virtuous, this isn't evidence of its truth. Some religious people will claim that their religious beliefs are all that stand between them and a life of vice, illegality, killing, looting, maiming, utter license, and debauchery. Some will go even further and say that this is not only true of them, but everyone else, and that the whole society is upheld by their religious beliefs, and that that's what keeps society safe. These claims, however, are undoubtedly self-deceit, as the previous data shows. Some theists may reply, Jordan Peterson, that the naturalists are the ones who are self-deceived, and that the reason they don't do the above-mentioned vices is because they internalized religious teachings against killing, looting, maiming, etc., and the sanctions against these things can't be given a naturalistic justification. However, the explanation is precisely backwards. Evolution provides a far more plausible explanation for these sanctions, and after we're selected against these vices, religious teachings in part then come along as a response to these natural selections and codify what we've already been selected for in teachings. So that debunks the whole, Our culture's underlying ethos is embedded in a rich biblical corpus. It isn't obvious that you're a real atheist, as you're not Raskolnikov. The underlying biblical corpus, which serves as a necessary metaphysical substrate with which our actions are guided, if lost, would turn us invariably into a bunch of angry primates. We'd continuously bash each other in over the head with lobsters. Ah! And again, this is not exactly verbatim from Graham Oppy's book, rather this is my interpretation. But putting that whole rant aside, that concludes the sixth piece of data. Human morality and flourishing has not been shown to favor either theism or naturalism, so we move on to our seventh piece of data: consciousness and reason. If your subjective conscious mental states are just neurochemical states, this would favor naturalism, as neurochemical states and processes can't occur in a supernatural entity. But what if our subjective conscious experiences occur in a soul? Well, if the naturalist grants this, they would then believe in two kinds of entities, the physical ones and the non-physical ones. But the theist has a still far more complex hypothesis, as they're committed to everything that the naturalist says exists, and furthermore, like gods and the supernatural domain. Thus, theism is still more complex and should only be preferred if it can offer up an explanatory advantage. So let's turn then to some alleged explanatory advantages theism has to offer. Some theists will say that they can explain consciousness being in global causal reality altogether. But of course, this is defeated by the oppy opening, which is to list the theoretical commitments open to both the naturalist and the theist and show an equivalence. Oppy shows that both sides here will posit three primitive commitments. The first, for the theist, is that they will say consciousness is a primitive property of God. Second, so is the connection between it and other properties of God. Third, if we think of God as a substance, the connection between consciousness and the divine substance is also an unexplained theoretical primitive. The naturalist will have three primitive commitments as well here. The naturalist will say consciousness is a primitive property of the soul, so is the connection between it and other properties. And if we think of the soul as a substance, the connection between consciousness and the soul substance is primitive as well. What about considerations pertaining to the causal connection between brain and soul? Do these considerations favor naturalism over theism or vice versa? Oppy will say no, using his famous opening, showing the options available here to both the theist and naturalist is to explain the connections between brain and soul in terms of contingent explanations or necessary explanations. Either way, we get equal theoretical commitment, and the considerations therefore between the connection between brain and soul do not favor either theism or naturalism. How does he do this specifically? Well, he says that both views will have to say that a soul comes and goes given a certain level of brain function/dysfunction. Both will have to explain this by appealing to contingency or necessity. For example, the naturalist will have to say either that the brain necessarily, given a certain level of function or dysfunction, causes a soul to come or go. Well, the theist will have to say that God made some brain-soul relations out of necessity. In other words, he made some laws governing the relation between the brain and soul out of necessity. Or both can say those same two things, but contingently are those two things the case. Either way, both theoretical commitments are equal here. One may counter that the above only works if souls can't be independent from the brain, but we have evidence that they could be. For example, near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, communication with the dead. These are all indicative of the soul being able to be independent from the brain. However, even if we had reliable evidence of these things happening, the very report of these things necessitates the brain is still existing. And also, talking with the dead was covered by our previous points about miracles and the anomalous. What about reason and inference? Humans can engage in inference with explicit appeal to math and logical principles. Now, accounting for the ability to do this solely by evolution doesn't work. Is this a problem for the naturalist? No. The naturalist need not appeal to these very principles to account for them. As we've already seen, in order for one to be reasonable to begin with, he must already be so programmed, rather than attempting to justify logic with logic. But additionally, vast amounts of data show that our minds have two distinct cognitive subsystems. By the way, this will show that not all our reasoning is marked by explicit appeal to governing principles. This is because the first system, System 1, is fast and automatic and has within it embedded a whole host of logical inferences that are of course prone to error. Additionally, we have a second system, System 2. This is slow, intentional, and controlled. So given the full range of cognition and human ability, it is not the case that these considerations support theism over naturalism. If anything, these considerations may favor naturalism. Certainly on standard theism, we could ask, why would God bother to make a System 1? Given how prone to error it is, System 1 is certainly surprising here. That concludes the 7th piece of data, consciousness and reason. We will now move on to the 8th piece of data, religious experience. What to make of the reports of mystical experiences? First of all, there seem to be conditions that predispose one to having mystical experiences. Mental illness, depression, schizophrenia, epilepsy, strokes, drugs, bodily insult, starvation, mortification, extreme exercise, extreme sexual activity, near-death experience, rhythmical activities, meditation, prayer, trance, music, dance, chant, and so forth. These conditions are not noted for their cognitive reliability. Many of these things negatively correlate with reasoning and inference tasks. So here, clearly, there is room for doubt. But what about under normal conditions? Well, under normal conditions, the naturalist may well also have what is called mystical experiences. However, clearly, the naturalist doesn't interpret these as religious. So it's not obvious how to interpret these sorts of experiences. Second, we have a good explanation for these experiences in the vicinity, in terms of cognitive science and evolutionary theory. There is considerable evidence that System 1, which we mentioned earlier, is strongly overprone to attribute agency. Take, for instance, the noise you hear at night, and think of an intruder in your kitchen. Third, even if we grant that the theist has mystical experiences not supplied to the naturalist, mutually incompatible religions lay claim to religious experiences conferring the truth of their doctrine. So it seems when considering religious experience, neither theism or naturalism is favored by the considerations here. We conclude the 8th piece of data and move on to the 9th. The 9th piece of data is scripture, authority, and organized tradition. There's no need to elaborate much here. Given the mutual incompatibility of the world's religious teachings, it seems the content of these teachings favors neither theism or naturalism. This concludes all 9 pieces of data that we consider on minimal theism and naturalism. Prior to the introduction of this data, naturalism had an advantage to theism in its simplicity. Given that the data didn't favor minimal theism to minimal naturalism, the initial advantage naturalism had was not overturned. Therefore, it should be preferred. What about standard theism and naturalism? Standard theism states there is a God who is omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, the source, ground, or originating cause of everything that can have a source, ground, or originating cause. We will then compare this to standard naturalism on the following data. 1. Suffering. 2. Salvation. 3. Meaning and purpose. 4. Hiddenness and non-belief. Starting with horrendous suffering. Horrendous suffering is not in tension with and may even be expected under naturalism. But under standard theism, it seems there's some explaining to do. So what are some attempted explanations? An attempted explanation for suffering is that there is no suffering, just absence of flourishing. The response here is that you could call it what you want, it still needs to be explained. Another attempt is to say that suffering is needed for gratitude. There are a few responses to this claim. First, we could be made to feel grateful without having to suffer. We're talking about an all-powerful God after all. Second, it seems we see far more suffering than is required in order to be grateful. Third, it seems some things couldn't lead to gratitude. Like a baby being raped and killed ain't alive to be grateful. Another attempted explanation of suffering is to say that life is only valuable if we can suffer, and that suffering is required for human development. This, however, is obviously wrong. We can have lives of value absent much of the suffering. Additionally, much of the horrendous suffering actually seems to lead to ingratitude and stunts growth. Another attempted explanation is that freedom is better than suffering. Although it's typically not put like that, people will imply that by saying that we have suffering because we have free will. But this implies that freedom of will is a worth it trade-off given all the suffering we have. But this is so painfully wrong. The world would be a far better place. We would all be better off if everything was equal, but the brain contains some sort of chip that prevents rape from ever occurring. Even if we are mistaken here, and freedom is a worth it trade-off for all the pain we receive, freedom still does not explain all of the suffering caused naturally. by hurricanes, tsunamis, wildfires, plagues, famine, etc. An attempted explanation for this is that natural pain is caused by demons, the devil, and the like. And yeah, that's very lame. It's a huge increase in your theory's complexity if you're now positing as explanations for suffering, demons, and the devil and the like. Another attempted explanation is that we can't understand God. The response is that we don't need to understand God in order to know that a baby being raped and killed doesn't obtain a greater good while this is happening for the baby. Now, some might respond that while it's not good for the baby while it's happening, the baby dies and then in the afterlife is compensated for what it had to endure. But this, of course, increases the complexity of your theory, and given the broader discussion about the simplicity and the virtue of naturalism to theism, this is not a winning move. Thus, it seems in conclusion about considerations of evil that they favor naturalism to standard theism. For even if the theist could explain away suffering, this will no doubt come in a drastic increase in the theory's complexity, further boosting naturalism's advantage. The second piece of data that we shall consider under the expansion to standard theism is salvation. Might we have grounds to try and cultivate belief in theism? Because if it true, and if we believed it, we might secure goods. Pascal's wager. Wagering for God is taking whatever course of action you think will most likely lead to your belief in God. So here's Pascal's argument. Premise 1. There's two mutually exclusive possibilities. God exists or he doesn't exist. Premise 2. Either you wager for him or you don't. Premise 3. If God exists, wagering for him yields infinite value, and not doing so equals finite value. Premise 4. The probability that God exists is non-zero and finite. Call the probability that God exists p, and the probability that he does not exist 1 minus p. Premise 5. The expected value of wagering for God equals the probability that God exists multiplied by the value of wagering for God if he exists, plus the probability that God does not exist multiplied by the value of wagering for God if he does not exist. Since we have p times infinite value and the second part 1 minus p times finite value, the total expected value is infinite. P6. The expected value of not wagering for God equals the probability that God exists multiplied by the value of not wagering for God if he exists, plus the probability that God does not exist multiplied by the value of not wagering for God if he does not exist. Since both of these values are finite, the total expected value is finite. P7. Rationality requires that you always act so as to maximize the expected value of your action. Conclusion, therefore you should wager for God. An objection to this argument is that it doesn't follow that I should wager for God, as I could construct scenarios where I wager for God conditional on X, where X doesn't necessitate that I actually wager for God. For example, I could say I will only wager for God conditional on winning the state lottery 3 times in a row. Pascal's argument applies in this case, as the potential expected value, given this condition on wagering for God, is still infinite. In fact, given infinite value, it seems one can potentially generate an infinite number of conditions on wagering, and in all cases, the expected value would be infinite, which entails that given just infinite value, we are not advised as to how to act to maximize our potential value. One could respond that given infinite value, one should act in a way that is most likely to secure that infinite value. But this suggestion doesn't help, as one could think of many potential infinite values that are mutually inconsistent and no more likely than the other. Also, if the naturalist thinks that infinite value is impossible, then Pascal's wager simply question begs against the naturalist. Additionally, Islam and Christianity are both possibly true and both promise infinite value. That concludes the second piece of data. Let's move on to the third, meaning and purpose. Some theists say that theism gives meaning and purpose, naturalism does not, and this is reason to prefer theism. Now, I don't like how Oppy replies to this consideration. He effectively says that naturalists could live a good life according to Aristotle's notion of a good life. So I will give my own response here, which is that if meaning is a basis to prefer a worldview, one can endlessly generate worldviews with more meaning than theism. Will theists prefer these? We can stipulate a worldview that contains within it the maximal possible meaning a worldview can have. I'm quite sure, however, that the stipulation of this worldview does not move the theist, or anyone for that matter, at all. Now, if one responds the reason they are not moved is because in absence of supporting evidence for the worldview, we reply that this is precisely the issue present in theism. Also, of course, the meaning that a worldview provides doesn't thereby increase its likelihood of being true. That concludes the third piece of data, so we move on to the fourth and last: hiddenness and non-belief. If theism were true, we would expect evidence of theism. But if the evidence favors naturalism, or if the evidence is neutral, this is surprising under theism and thus evidence against it. Therefore, an absence of evidence for theism is evidence against it. Some may attempt to reply that the absence of evidence is explained in terms of free will. However, this doesn't work, as knowledge of God does not equal knowledge of what actions to do and does not diminish our free will. One may attempt to respond that God has reasons we can't grasp for hiding the evidence. However, naturalism has a great explanation available for why there's an absence of evidence. This is surely preferable to there might be an explanation. This concludes the analysis of standard theism and all 13 pieces of data. As we have seen, naturalism is simpler, the data does not favor theism, so naturalism wins. As theism is an extension of naturalism, theism is committed to all of the natural commitments naturalism makes, but then theism adds further commitments. He ends off by saying that despite all the analyses we've given, one must proceed with humility. One can contest the analyses given of the data, and may even introduce additional data not here considered. Certainly many theists are still rationally justified in holding to their theistic beliefs. This is a complex issue. The discussion here is far from over. One should always exhibit humility, intellectual curiosity, openness, and the ability to admit when we are wrong. If you've enjoyed or benefited from this video, please subscribe or give a like. This was not easy to produce, and I'd appreciate some support.